The man known to history as Frederick Douglass is understood to have been born at some point in either 1817 or 1818 on Home Hill Farm, part of the larger Y plantation in Talbot County in Maryland. He was born into slavery, and his exact date of birth is unclear, with Douglass stating later in life that he couldn't be sure what age he was. He celebrated it as though it was the 14th of February, 1818, St. Valentine's Day, as he did recall that his mother referred to him as Little Valentine. His surname in his early years was Bailey. Douglass was the surname he adopted as a freeman in his early adult years. Frederick's mother was Harriet Bailey, an enslaved African-American woman. She was born in 1792 and gave birth to 7 children between 1813 and 1825. She was often hired out to other farms in the Talbot County area, but sometimes walked 12 miles to visit her children at night. Frederick later claimed that he never saw his mother in daylight, and she died in 1826 when Frederick was only around 8 years old. Frederick knew that his father was a white man, but he didn't know his exact identity. It was rumored that his father was Aaron Anthony, the owner of many of the slaves at Home Hill Farm. He was around 50 years of age around the time that Frederick was born. Frederick remembered Anthony as a brutal man, recalling an incident from the age of 6 when he saw his 15-year-old Aunt Hester being brutally whipped after resisting Anthony's advances. If Anthony was his father, then Frederick was almost certainly born as a result of sexual violence. Frederick was born in a period of transition in the history of slavery, both in the United States and the Western world more generally. The 18th century was the peak of the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade, and yet the final decades of it had also witnessed the rise of a strong abolitionist movement in both Britain and in the United States. By the time Frederick was born, several of the more northerly states in the U.S., such as Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, had become free states, states where slavery was prohibited. New York had agreed to do so by 1827. Furthermore, the British first banned the slave trade in 1807 and then the institution of slavery altogether in 1833, with the Royal Navy moving to begin imposing the new laws on the world's oceans. In the U.S., however, the economy of the southern states, Maryland included, was based to a great extent around the cultivation of cotton and tobacco, and to a huge extent on plantations run by slave labor. Consequently, even as more and more countries in Europe moved to prohibit slavery, along with an increasing number of free northern states in the U.S., states like Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama made it clear that they were opposed to ending the ban. This was the political context of slavery Frederick grew up within. Frederick grew up in the cabin of his grandparents, Isaac and Betsy Bailey, until he was around 6 years of age. At that time, Frederick went to live in the Anthony house near the main house at Y. Although several of his siblings and cousins were among the slaves at Y, Frederick's closest companion in his younger years was Daniel Lloyd, the son of Edward Lloyd, the owner of the Y plantation. Unlike his friend Daniel, Frederick did not receive any schooling at Y, but he was an intelligent child with an excellent memory. Unfortunately, many of his earliest memories were of William Sevier and Orson Gore, the 2 head overseers of the farm, carrying out beatings of the slaves there. Aside from Daniel Lloyd, young Frederick recalled being treated favourably by Lucretia Auld, the wife of Thomas Auld. She was the daughter of Aaron Anthony, and so was quite possibly Frederick's half-sister. It was through her interventions that Frederick was sent to Baltimore in 1826, around the time his mother died. There he entered the service of Lucretia's brother-in-law, Hugh Auld, and his wife Sophia, the idea being that Frederick would provide companionship to Hugh's young son Tommy. At the time, Baltimore was a city of 80,000 people, of which 14,000 were freed slaves, the largest concentration of free black people in the country, and Frederick's arrival here was a revelation in terms of how those African Americans who had obtained their freedom lived so much better off than slaves. Sophia Auld also behaved more like a mother towards him here, and it was she who taught him to read. In October 1827, when Aaron Anthony died back on the Y plantation, there was a possibility that Frederick would be sold or moved elsewhere, but the Aulds managed it so he was able to remain with them in Baltimore. Hugh and Sophia were happy to have Frederick back, though Frederick soon learned that Hugh Auld was less enamoured of the idea of slaves being allowed to learn to read than his wife was. Thereafter he continued to educate himself in secret, smuggling newspapers or whatever reading material he could find into his sleeping quarters. One day, in 1830, he obtained a second-hand copy of The Columbian Orator, written by Caleb Bingham. The book included extracts of speeches from the ancient Athenian and Roman orators, Demosthenes and Cicero, along with more recent political figures such as George Washington and Napoleon Bonaparte. The book not only cultivated some of the ideas Frederick already had in his mind about the master-slave dynamic, but also gave him the tools to become one of the most powerful orators of his age. Frederick also learned to write by copying out passages from the book, along with a copy of the Bible. Furthermore, from the newspapers he could get his hands on, he was able to get a sense of a struggle between slaveholders and abolitionists in the United States, notably through stories of the Nat Turner slave rebellion of 1831. Around this time, when Frederick was around 13 or 14, he also experienced a religious awakening inspired by Methodist preachers who asserted that all men were equal in the eyes of God. In March 1833, Frederick's life took another turn as he was forced back to the eastern shore after a dispute between Thomas and Hugh Auld. He would spend the next 2 years here. In 1835, Frederick was then hired out to William Freeland, a man who adopted a more lenient attitude towards his slaves. During this time, Frederick and several other slaves planned an ambitious escape in April 1836, but the group's plan was betrayed and they were rounded up and sent off to prison in the town of Easton. There, a minor miracle happened. As he sat in prison anticipating that he would now be sold to work in one of the plantations in the more southerly states, Thomas Auld came and informed him that he was sending Frederick back to Baltimore to live with Hugh and Sophia to learn a trade with the promise of freedom on his 25th birthday with good behavior. In Baltimore, Frederick was sent to the shipyards where he trained as an apprentice caulker. Here he began to socialize with Baltimore's free black community, and it was also during this time that he first met Anna Murray, a free black woman about 5 years older than him who worked as a servant at the postmaster's house. The two fell in love and agreed to marry. In May 1838, Frederick managed to come to an agreement with Hugh Auld, allowing him to take his own lodgings and keep any wages above $3 per week. This new arrangement lasted until August 1838. At that juncture, Hugh Auld accused Frederick of attempting to escape. Fearing that he might be sold and split up from Anna, Frederick decided that he would actually try to elope. On the 3rd of September 1838, dressed as a sailor and carrying official documentation from a retired sailor friend, Frederick took a train from Baltimore heading north. When he arrived in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, he stepped onto free soil for the first time. From there, he took another train north and eventually reached New York. At 20 years of age, he was free, but on his own. After adopting the name Frederick Johnson, he sent a letter to Anna in Baltimore asking her to come to New York. On the 15th of September, 3 days after her arrival, the two were married. Acting on advice, Anna and Frederick quickly left New York for New Bedford, Massachusetts, where they called on Nathan and Mary Johnson. When Nathan Johnson advised the new arrivals to choose a new surname as there were already a dozen fugitive slaves named Johnson, Frederick asked his host what name he should adopt. Having just read Walter Scott's The Lady of the Lake, Johnson suggested the name of the Scottish clan Douglas, to which Frederick added an extra S for distinctiveness. Thus was born the famous name of Frederick Douglass. The Douglasses settled in New Bedford for the next few years. Frederick attempted to find a job as a caulker, but was turned down when the white caulkers threatened to walk out if he was hired. As a result, for the next 3 years, he made a living working small jobs. During this time, Anna gave birth to their daughter Rosetta in June 1839 and a son named Louis in October 1840. Douglas also became a leading figure at the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church during this time, where he preached to a community of fugitive and freed slaves. He began reading The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper published on a weekly basis by William Lloyd Garrison, a prominent promoter of the abolition of slavery in the whole of the United States, and when Garrison visited New Bedford in April 1839, Douglas pledged himself to the abolitionist cause. Thereafter, the cause of abolitionism inspired his sermons in church, and in August 1841 he spoke for the first time to white abolitionists, including Garrison, at a convention in Nantucket, where he moved the audience by vividly describing his experiences as a slave. Following this performance, Douglas travelled throughout New England on the abolitionist speaking circuit. After a 3-month trial period, in early 1842, he was hired by the American Anti-Slavery Society as a full-time lecturer. Over the next few years, as he travelled from town to town across the northern states, he would build a reputation as one of the most powerful speakers for the abolitionist cause. From July to December 1843, Douglas joined several leading abolitionists in the 100 Conventions campaign, aiming to reach between 300,000 and 500,000 people by speaking at 100 meetings across the northern states. Douglas was a strong supporter of Garrison's position that the U.S. Constitution needed to be changed to alter the status of slavery on a federal level. They were opposed by political moderates from New York who founded the Liberty Party, a political party that intended to advance the cause of abolitionism through more gradual means. Douglas was present at the 1843 Colored Convention in Buffalo, New York, where Henry Highland Garnet made an impassioned speech urging resistance to slavery by force. Douglas rejected Garnet's advocacy for insurrection as irresponsible and unrealistic, remaining faithful to the Garrisonian doctrine of non-resistance. But only a few weeks later, Douglas and his fellow speakers were beaten by a mob in Pendleton, Indiana, which damaged his right hand permanently. Following the incident, Douglas began to turn away from non-resistance, and his attachment to Garrison's rigorous orthodoxy started to wane. While Douglas was on his speaking tours, Anna had two more children, Frederick Jr. in March 1842 and Charles in October 1844. Following the latter's birth, Frederick spent more time at home, and between 1844 and May 1845, he wrote his first autobiography, a narrative on the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. This soon became an international bestseller. At this juncture, fearing that Douglas's newfound fame might endanger him from slave catchers who, theoretically, could detain him and return him to the Olds in Maryland, his abolitionist friends sent him on a 2-year speaking tour of the British Isles. Douglas started his tour in Ireland, where he met with Daniel O'Connell, an Irish land reformer and politician who campaigned against British rule. While Douglas rejected the analogy that British rule in Ireland was the same as slavery in the United States, once he witnessed the degree of poverty that pertained in Ireland, just as the Great Famine was beginning there, he spoke passionately about the plight of starving Irishmen and women. Douglas was received with equal fervour in Scotland. By May 1846, he was in London, about to start a tour of England, where Garrison joined him in August. While there, at the end of 1846, Douglas's friends back in the U.S., Ellen Richardson and her sister-in-law Anna, managed to raise £150 to buy Frederick's freedom from Hugh Auld. Thus, when Douglas arrived back in America in the spring of 1847, he did so as a completely free man without the fear of capture hanging over him. Not long after his return home, Douglas considered launching his own anti-slavery newspaper. On a final tour with Garrison in the summer of 1847, Douglas echoed his mentor's call for northern states to separate from the Union and establish their own fully free republic. Douglas partnered with Pittsburgh journalist Martin Delaney to launch a black newspaper. The North Star was published for the first time on the 3rd of December 1847 from Rochester in New York. During the following year, Douglas wrote for the paper every week. In July 1848, he became a prominent member of the women's rights movement by being the only black person to attend the Seneca Falls Convention organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The delegates unanimously supported resolutions demanding equality in labor, law, family, and other areas of life, but the convention was split on women's right to vote. Douglas spoke forcefully in favor of female suffrage and may have helped the resolution pass. Meanwhile, in 1848, Douglas also used his newspaper to advance the cause of the Free Soil Party. This was a party which briefly existed between 1848 and 1854 in the United States. Led by the former president, Martin Van Buren, its goal was to prevent slavery being extended into the new parts of the United States which had been won at the end of the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. Douglas was ultimately disappointed when General Zachary Taylor, the slave-owning hero of the recent war in Mexico, but a figure with a very vague political platform, emerged victorious. In May 1849, Douglas's English friend Julia Griffiths moved to Rochester to help Douglas edit and manage the North Star. Under Griffiths' influence, in 1850, the wealthy New York abolitionist Gerrit Smith helped to keep the North Star financially afloat. In 1851, the North Star was merged with Smith's newspaper, the Liberty Party paper, to form what was termed Frederick Douglass's paper. Douglas's association with Smith prompted his former speaking companions to denounce him as an enemy and a traitor, while Douglas sought the moral high ground by declaring his willingness to work with anyone to advance the abolitionist cause. In September 1853, Garrison himself wrote how Douglas had been cursed by selfish ambition and insinuated that Douglas and Griffiths were having an affair. The bitter internecine struggle among the two most prominent leaders of the abolitionist movement died down following an intervention by the author of the acclaimed abolitionist novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who managed to have Douglas and Garrison reach a peace accord with one another. The 1850s were a period of growing tensions between free states in the north of the Union and the slave-owning states of the South and further to the west towards Texas. The westward expansion of the United States and American victory in the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 had raised questions over whether slavery would be extended westwards beyond Texas to the West Coast, where the California gold rush had led to a huge wave of migration from 1848 onwards. California soon applied for admission to the Union as a state, but on the basis of being a free state. The southern states had resisted this and were determined to avoid California setting such a precedent of banning slavery in states newly admitted into the Union. This, in turn, led to the Compromise of 1850, a congressional move which allowed for California to join the Union as a free state while passing a Fugitive Slave Act that provided for stricter penalties for fugitive slaves and those who aided them. It was a watershed moment for Douglas. After the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, he turned his back on pacifist approaches and instead began advising his audiences where he spoke to protect fugitive slaves and resist attempts to capture them. In his speeches and his journalism, he increasingly justified the killing of slave bounty hunters and slave owners, not only as self-defense, but as a way in which black men could assert their humanity in defending their natural rights. In July 1852, Douglas was invited to give an Independence Day speech before the Rochester Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society, where Griffiths was secretary. He began by praising the Founding Fathers and their ringing words of liberty, only to denounce the hypocrisy of slavery in a republic founded on such ideals. Speaking on behalf of all slaves, past and present, Douglas asked his audience why they had invited him, telling them, "This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn." Douglas claimed that the Fugitive Slave Act had transformed the country into a hunting ground for men, before lashing out at the churchmen who knelt in prayer while their hands were dripping with the blood of slaves. Yet he ended on a hopeful note. expressing faith in the anti-slavery principles of the Constitution and the March of Progress. In delivering the famous speech, Douglas placed himself in the tradition of Old Testament prophets seeking a way out of the new Babylonian captivity for his people. In response to another request from Griffiths and the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, this time to write a short story for a collection, Autographs for Freedom, Douglas wrote his first and only work of fiction. In his 1853 novella, The Heroic Slave, Douglas adapted the tale of Madison Washington, an enslaved cook on the ship Creole who had led a successful rebellion on board, killing a slaveholder, subduing the crew, and ordering the vessel to sail to Nassau in the Bahamas, where the slaves on board obtained their freedom. By 1855, Douglas had reinvented himself as a political abolitionist, and that summer he produced his second autobiography, Bondage and Freedom, not only updating his narrative of 10 years earlier, but also charting his evolution as a campaigner and thinker. Shortly afterwards, Julia Griffiths left for England, and with fewer writers contributing to his paper and funding issues, the paper was renamed Douglas's Monthly in 1858. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act sought to repeal the Missouri Compromise, an act which had been passed back in 1820 to ban slavery north of a line lying along 36.5 degrees north of the equator, instead arguing that Kansas and Nebraska should be allowed to decide the status of slavery in their jurisdictions themselves. The legislation led to a series of bloody confrontations in Kansas between pro- and anti-slavery settlers. In the midst of this, Douglas proposed sending 1,000 free black families to settle in Kansas, the idea being to tip the settler population on balance in support of abolition in the region. His plan didn't come to fruition, but the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act did lead directly to the establishment of the Republican Party, an important development in the history of slavery in the U.S. This brought together various political groups, such as the Free Soil Party, who wanted to stop the expansion of slavery. Douglas found much to criticize about the Republicans, since they did not propose to abolish slavery where it already existed. However, they were much more opposed to the institution than the Democratic Party, which, in the middle decades of the 19th century, had become the party of the slave-owning southern states. Thus, in August 1856, Douglas indicated his support for Republican presidential candidate John C. Fremont in the November elections. Fremont received 33% of the popular vote, an impressive feat for a new party, but was unable to prevent the Democratic candidate James Buchanan from becoming president. In the late 1850s, Douglas was involved in the attempted insurrection of the white abolitionist John Brown. Brown and Douglas had known each other since the 1840s, and Brown regularly talked about leading a slave rebellion in Virginia, operating as a guerrilla fighter from the Appalachian Mountains. Now, in early 1858, in the aftermath of the Dred Scott decision handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1857, which effectively declared that African Americans did not have the same constitutional rights as white people, Brown proposed to Douglas that he would attack the federal arsenal located at Harper's Ferry in the state of Virginia and use the weapons acquired there to launch a slave rebellion in the wider region. Douglas considered the scheme unrealistic, but offered financial and organizational assistance. On the night of the 16th of October, Brown's band of 19 men captured the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, but by the 18th, the raid was over and a heavily wounded Brown was taken captive and executed on the 2nd of December. In the days that followed, Douglas was accused of being one of the organizers of the raid, forcing him to escape to Canada, from where he boarded a ship to England in mid-November. In Britain, he undertook a 6-month speaking tour in which he hailed John Brown as a martyr. While he was so engaged, an official investigation was carried out back in the US into the raid on Harper's Ferry, one which ultimately exonerated Douglas. While the investigation was still ongoing, Douglas received news that his youngest child, Annie, had died on the 13th of March, prompting him to make arrangements to go back home to his grieving family, arriving back in Rochester in late April 1860. In the months that followed his return to America, Douglas was mainly concerned with the presidential election of 1860. Owing to a growing split within the Democratic Party between a northern group and a southern faction, it seemed likely that the Republican Party candidate, an Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, would triumph. Once again, Douglas struggled to reconcile his radicalism with the moderation of the Republican Party and its candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was an abolitionist, though one who was more concerned about avoiding a civil war and saving the Union. He won just below 40% of the popular vote in the election and was not even on the ballot in several southern states. But in a highly divisive election, he still triumphed after obtaining the highest number of votes in the Electoral College. While the state of South Carolina threatened to secede from the Union, Douglas feared and expected a compromise between pro- and anti-slavery politicians in Washington to save the Union. He was consequently surprised when South Carolina seceded from the Union on the 20th of December over the possibility that Lincoln would abolish slavery across the country. In the months that followed, in early 1861, 6 other southern states followed South Carolina and seceded from the Union to form what was termed the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy. With this, the American Civil War was about to begin. Once the Civil War began on the 12th of April 1861 with the Southern Confederacy's bombardment of the Federal garrison at Fort Sumter, Douglas seized on the prospect of eradicating slavery through armed conflict. He rallied to President Lincoln and the volunteers who fought in the Union Army, and in his writings throughout the period from 1861 to 1865 urged the bold prosecution of the war and the destruction of the South and its slave society. Yet he was also frustrated at times, particularly with the reluctance of Lincoln and the Union government to use black regiments to fight the war, especially where slaves who had escaped from the South were concerned, while also expressing concern over Lincoln's delays in passing measures to ensure that slavery would be abolished nationwide once the war ended. These came over time, though. In the course of 1862, Lincoln and the Republicans gradually passed abolitionist measures. Congress freed the slaves in the Capital District of Columbia in April of that year and banned slavery in all Western territories in June. In July, Lincoln signed the Second Confiscation Act, which freed slaves in Confederate territory occupied by Union armies, as well as slaves who had escaped to Union lines. Douglas welcomed these efforts, which were increasingly regarded by Northerners as acts of military necessity in order to win the war. On the 17th of September 1862, the Battle of Antietam occurred in Maryland as General McClellan's forces faced the Army of Northern Virginia, led by Robert E. Lee. In the bloodiest day of combat in American history, McClellan forced Lee to retreat, though Lincoln castigated him for failing to pursue and destroy the Confederate army. Following this imperfect victory, Lincoln was confident enough to issue the Emancipation Proclamation on the 22nd of September, which announced to the South that from the 1st of January 1863, all slaves in the states in rebellion from the Union shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Douglas seized upon these words with renewed hope and, recognizing Lincoln's instinctive cautiousness before making any commitments, was optimistic that Lincoln would stop at nothing to make the words of the proclamation reality. Lincoln's proclamation opened the door to finally recruit black men into the Union Army. Massachusetts was the first state to recruit black soldiers, and in January 1863, Governor John Andrew began to recruit men into the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. Douglas acted as a recruiting agent for the unit. In March 1863, he published an editorial entitled Men of Color to Arms in his monthly newspaper. Then, on the 18th of May, Douglas joined Garrison for the 54th's presentation of colors at Reedville, Massachusetts, following which the regiment left Boston for South Carolina. In its first major action of the war in mid-July, the 54th led a desperate assault on Fort Wagner on the approaches to Charleston Harbor, resulting in the deaths of around 300 men. Yet, even as the men of the 54th fought and died for the Union, the War Department was paying these soldiers $3 less per month than their white comrades. Having learned this, in August 1863, Douglas traveled to Washington and met Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to lobby for equal pay. After receiving an offer to help General Lorenzo Thomas in the Mississippi Valley with the recruitment and organization of black troops, Douglas went to the White House to meet President Lincoln. In a frank conversation, Lincoln defended his gradual approach towards emancipation, citing the need to prepare public opinion. On pay inequality for black soldiers, the president told a disappointed Douglas that it was a necessary concession to the white soldiers which he made to avoid tensions within the military. Overall, Douglas emerged from the meeting with a sense of respect and admiration for the president, who promised him that slavery would not survive the war. 1863 was undoubtedly a major turning point in the war. The foremost engagement of the entire conflict was fought at the Battle of Gettysburg over a period of 3 days at the beginning of July near Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. In the course of it, General George Meade repulsed Lee's second northern invasion and forced the Confederates to withdraw south. In the west, General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, gaining control of the Mississippi and splitting the Confederacy in two. In his famous Gettysburg Address from November 1863, President Lincoln envisaged a new birth of freedom at the end of the war. As he returned to the lecture circuit at the end of the year, and with the result of the war looking more and more like a Union victory, Douglas turned his attention towards the next battles, fighting racial discrimination in Northern society and obtaining the right to vote and hold office. Frustrated at Lincoln's unwillingness to commit too quickly to economic and political rights for freed slaves, Douglas supported the third-party candidacy of John C. Fremont in the 1864 presidential election. who ran under the Radical Democracy Party ticket as a fringe challenger to Lincoln. In early September, the Democrats nominated General George McClellan, a mediocre commander, but an extremely popular one among the Union armies. On the 19th of August, Douglas met Lincoln for a second time at the president's invitation. When their conversation was interrupted by a secretary informing Lincoln that the governor of Connecticut was waiting to see him, the president gave instructions to tell the governor to wait, for "I want to have a long talk with my friend Frederick Douglass." Lincoln confided to Douglas his fears of losing the election and the prospect of a negotiated peace, and asked Douglas to formulate a plan to encourage as many slaves as possible to flee from the South before the election. With this new responsibility upon his shoulders, Douglas formulated a plan for sub-agents appointed by him to operate in urban areas of rebel states to lead squads of slaves into the North in close cooperation with Union generals. Douglas's ambitious plan to move slaves from the southern states to the free North ultimately proved to be unnecessary. General William T. Sherman captured Atlanta on the 2nd of September 1864, striking at the heart of the Confederacy. The news convinced many Northerners that the war would soon be over, and when Fremont withdrew his candidacy later that month, Douglas rallied to the Republicans again. While Douglas did not campaign officially for Lincoln, as president of a black convention at Syracuse, New York in October 1864, Douglas warned his audience not to miss the chance of crushing slavery and ending racism, urging victory over both the Democratic Party and the Confederacy. Following a bitter campaign in which the Democrats tried to claim Lincoln had African ancestry, the president won re-election with 212 electoral votes to 21, receiving 78% of the popular vote among Union soldiers. A few days later, General Sherman launched a devastating campaign, marching from Atlanta to the port of Savannah, destroying everything in his path. This was the sort of warfare that Douglas had preached in order to build a new free society, and Sherman's campaign caused a significant dent in Confederate morale. On the 3rd of February 1865, the Congress adopted the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, which was ratified by the states in December. Both the war and slavery were nearly at an end. Douglas traveled to Washington, D.C. for Lincoln's second inauguration on the 4th of March, 1865. In a speech reminiscent of Douglas's own rhetoric over the years, Lincoln vowed that every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. A month later, Union armies occupied the Confederate capital of Richmond, and on the 9th of April, Robert E. Lee surrendered at the courthouse in Appomattox. The war was effectively over, though it would still take several weeks to round up the remaining Confederate armies. Days after Lee's surrender, President Lincoln was assassinated on the 14th of April, 1865. Douglas was shocked to hear about the death of the president whom he had come to admire, and later remarked on how the shared grief over Lincoln's demise provided Douglas with a sense of kinship with his fellow Americans. With the end of the American Civil War, Douglas reached a crossroads in his life. A sign of this was seen in May 1865 when he attended the 32nd anniversary meeting of the Anti-Slavery Society. Here, the main topic of debate was whether or not the organization should now disband, given that the war had achieved their ultimate goal, or continue on to achieve further liberties for the African American community. At the meeting, Garrison argued that it would be absurd to maintain an anti-slavery organization when slavery no longer existed, but Douglas urged the society to work towards other initiatives, especially expanding the franchise. In the period that followed, he sided with the radical Republicans in Congress, who fought President Andrew Johnson for control over Reconstruction, the policy which aimed to rebuild the southern states in a way which would heal the Union. Johnson was a Tennessee Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, and his place on Lincoln's presidential ticket was regarded as a show of national unity during the war. But unionism aside, Johnson was a conservative who sought to reintegrate the South back into the Union as soon as possible, and readmitted southern states into the Union with black codes that continued to restrict the liberties of freed slaves. By early 1866, congressional Republicans sought to seize control of the Reconstruction agenda from the president, passing a bill to strengthen the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal government agency set up the previous year to manage the affairs of the newly freed slaves in the South. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1866, which guaranteed citizenship without regard to race, Congress strengthened constitutional protections by adopting the 14th Amendment, a measure which provided a guarantee of citizenship and equal rights to all people in the U.S. Douglas considered it his new vocation to advocate for a radical vision of Reconstruction that protected the 4 million freed slaves. Although he was impressed by the equal rights protections offered by the 14th Amendment, Douglas opposed the amendment as it did not confer the right to vote. Douglas's campaign for black male suffrage inspired campaigners and writers such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton to begin calling for women to have the right to vote as well in America. While Douglas supported female suffrage, at the end of 1866, he argued that black suffrage was a matter of life and death, while for women it was only desirable. Douglas's position attracted racial insults from the women's rights leaders. After Congress passed the 15th Amendment in February 1869, which gave all black men the vote without any provisions being made for women, Stanton argued that black women were better as slaves, and while Douglas continued to support a further amendment providing for female suffrage, the rift between him and the women's rights movement would never heal completely. During the post-war years, Douglas continued to travel on the lecture circuit in an effort to provide for an increasingly fractured family. His sons struggled to emerge from their illustrious father's shadow, working for unequal pay and struggling to meet their expenses, while his daughter Rosetta was finding it difficult to sustain a growing family with her husband, whose demands for financial assistance from Frederick caused a rift with her brothers. In 1870, Douglas bought the newspaper New National Era, which he edited in Washington along with his sons Lewis and Frederick Jr. He was in the capital when he heard the news that his house in Rochester had burned down in a fire on the 2nd of June, 1872. While his family and most of his library were saved, Douglas estimated that around $5,000 worth of possessions had been lost, a substantial sum at the time. He was in no doubt that it was a racially motivated arson attack. He linked the destruction of his house to the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacist organization linked to the Democratic Party, which sought to undermine Republican Reconstruction by unleashing a campaign of violence and intimidation against former slaves. In his paper, Douglas supported the new President Ulysses S. Grant's efforts to crack down on the Klan with federal troops. After the fire in Rochester, Douglas moved his entire family to Washington, D.C., where he continued to use his newspaper as his mouthpiece in the Reconstruction debate. He resisted the lost cause narrative from ex-Confederates who claimed that they had not been defeated in battle, but by the Union's economic superiority, and that the war had never been about slavery, but their way of life. Douglas was appalled by how the death of Robert E. Lee in 1870 was mourned not only in the South, but across the nation. He denounced the Democratic Party, resurgent on the back of anti-black intimidation, as a party of murder, robbery, treason, dishonesty, and fraud. He was grateful for the Republican Party's role in abolishing slavery and advancing black civil rights, and campaigned for General Grant's election in 1868 and his re-election in 1872. He also supported Grant's initiative to annex Santo Domingo, the modern-day Dominican Republic, as a refuge for freed slaves from the South who were threatened by the Klansmen. After visiting the island in early 1871 alongside a congressional commission, Douglas promoted annexation in the press. The initiative failed to win the support of the necessary two-thirds majority in the Senate due to opposition from radical Republican Senator Charles Sumner, who believed that annexation was admitting defeat in the South. By the middle of the 1870s, the Grant administration had effectively given up on Reconstruction. In 1873, the country suffered a deep economic depression as the railroad boom ended, causing a crash in the stock market and commodity prices, widespread unemployment, and the failure of thousands of businesses. The financial panic spread to the Freedmen's Bank, an institution created in 1865 where freedmen and their families could deposit their savings and take out loans. As the bank faced bankruptcy in 1874, in March, Douglas was asked by the board to become its new president to restore confidence in the institution. Despite loaning $10,000 to the bank out of his own pocket, Douglas was unable to prevent its collapse at the end of June. While Douglas's loans were repaid in full, most depositors eventually received 60 cents to the dollar. When he was criticized for his lack of financial experience, Douglas blamed corruption among its governors and lamented that Congress was no longer willing to help keep the bank afloat. In October that same year, he closed down his newspaper following a decline in subscribers, estimating that he had lost $10,000 in the whole venture. Douglas's personal fortunes waned alongside that of the Republican Party in the aftermath of the financial crisis of the mid-1870s. The Democrats overturned a Republican majority of 110 and won a majority of 60 in the midterm elections of 1874. A furious Douglas denounced the retreat from Reconstruction in a series of speeches in New Hampshire in early 1875, reminding his audiences that Union soldiers had not won the war in order to lose the peace. In a 4th of July speech that year, he asked, "If war among whites brought peace and liberty to black people, what will peace among the whites bring?" Controversially, Douglas criticized the black community for being dependent on white men for their freedom. When jubilant Democrats claimed that Douglas was calling on black people to desert the Republican Party, Douglas denied doing so, recognizing the Republicans as by far the friendlier party for the African American community. In June 1876, he attended the Republican National Convention in Cincinnati. There, Rutherford B. Hayes was nominated as the party's presidential candidate. Following this, in one of the closest and most controversial elections in United States history, Hayes won the election by a single electoral college vote. In an effort to pacify Southern Democrats, with his opponent, Samuel Tilden, clearly having won the popular vote, and who threatened to go to war over the disputed election, Hayes agreed to remove federal troops from the South, a move which effectively brought efforts at Reconstruction to an end. Segregation and the Jim Crow laws would follow in the former Confederate states. When Hayes took office in March 1877, he appointed Douglas as Marshal of the District of Columbia, a law enforcement role in the federal capital. The appointment was not only a symbolic step for the cause of African Americans, but gave Douglas a lucrative salary to support his family. It also allowed him to use his influence to secure government jobs for his sons. In June, he decided to return to Maryland for a poignant meeting with the aging Thomas Auld, during which the former master and slave settled their differences. During another visit to the Eastern Shore a year and a half later, he went to the farm where he had been born and located the old cedar tree beside his grandmother's long-lost cabin, from where he scooped up a couple of handfuls of soil to take home with him to Washington. Although Douglas himself had attained celebrity status and served the Hayes administration, the Democrats gained control of both houses of Congress in 1878, and the president had given up on federal protection for freedmen. In response, many black people decided to leave the South for Kansas, where they could count on Republican congressional representatives and a degree of federal protection. Douglas was almost alone among prominent black leaders opposing the Kansas exodus, arguing that it served as a concession to white racism and an admission of Confederate victory. He urged the freedmen to stay and fight for their rights at the ballot box in spite of the intimidation they faced. Though his critics labelled him out of touch with the reality on the ground, Douglas was unwilling to abandon all he had fought for during the past 2 decades. In 1878, Douglas and his family moved to Cedar Hill in Anacostia in Washington, D.C. Here he entertained an increasing number of grandchildren. In the 1880 elections, Douglas campaigned for the Republican candidate, James Garfield. Later, Douglas recalled with pride marching next to the outgoing and incoming presidents as Marshal during Garfield's inauguration in March 1881, but was disappointed when Garfield demoted him to the office of Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia. A few weeks after meeting Douglas, Garfield was mortally wounded by an assassin's bullet on the 2nd of July, dying an agonizing 79 days later. That summer, Douglas published yet another autobiography. The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass was his third and final effort at relating his life story. When he visited the Y plantation again in June 1881, Douglass was given a tour by the Lloyd family. The former slave was now the guest of honor. Having mourned the deaths of 4 grandchildren from various childhood diseases in August 1882, Douglass also faced the loss of his wife Anna, the woman who had built and managed a stable domestic life for the itinerant Douglass for more than 40 years. Her death was a heavy blow to Frederick, who spent a month in Maine in the summer of 1883 after suffering a period of intense emotional stress following Anna's passing. In January 1884, he decided to fill the void in his life by secretly marrying Helen Pitts, a 46-year-old white woman's rights activist whom Douglas employed in the recorder's office. Both bride and groom did not inform their families beforehand, but while Pitt's relatives condemned her for marrying a black man when they found out, Douglas's children resented him for marrying a woman who was not much older than them. In response to a hostile black press, Douglas reminded them that he himself was mixed race. By 1884, Douglas adopted a more pessimistic tone about the South, where freedmen continued to toil the fields of their old masters for wages so low that they could not leave. In the 18 years since its ratification, the 14th Amendment had been weakened by a series of Supreme Court rulings. In U.S. v. Cruikshank in 1873, the court ruled that the equal rights protections could only be enforced by the states rather than the federal government, and in an October 1883 ruling, the court decided that the protections in the 14th Amendment applied only to states rather than acts of discrimination by individuals or businesses. Douglas railed against the fact that the states' rights doctrine remained so embedded in the American political system that one of the landmark accomplishments of the Reconstruction era was rendered effectively meaningless. In the November presidential election, Grover Cleveland of New York became the first Democrat to win the White House since the American Civil War. Douglas was criticized for hanging on to the position of recorder as Cleveland entered office, but he justified this on the basis of his desire to further Cleveland's anti-corruption agenda. After Douglas was replaced as recorder in March 1886, he and Helen made plans for a trip to Europe. In a departure from the punishing speaking schedules of the past, Douglas intended to see the sights and visit old friends. After arriving in Liverpool in September, Douglas reconnected with the Richardson sisters, who had bought his freedom 40 years earlier. After 2.5 months in Paris, the Douglases travelled south to the Mediterranean and on to Italy, Egypt, and Greece, marvelling at wonders such as the ruins of the Roman Empire, the Great Pyramids at Giza outside Cairo, and the Acropolis of ancient Athens. On their way back west, they stopped in Italy and England again, before a brief sojourn in Ireland, where Douglas indicated his support for the Anglo-Irish politician Charles Stewart Parnell's campaign for Home Rule in Ireland, whereby a devolved Irish Parliament would be established in Dublin. Back in America, Douglas spoke to audiences of his great delight in visiting Egypt, the setting for the biblical tale of Joseph, the son of Jacob, who was sold into slavery by his brothers before using his ability to interpret dreams to become the Pharaoh's chief advisor. Douglas reinvented Joseph's story to reflect his own experience of rising from slavery to lead his people to freedom. In March 1888, after a speaking tour in South Carolina and Georgia, Douglas returned to Washington disillusioned by what he had seen in the South. At the Republican National Convention in June, he once again sought to remind his audience about the meaning of the Civil War. After Republican Benjamin Harrison was elected to the presidency, Douglas was appointed U.S. Minister to Haiti in the summer of 1889. For the next 2 years, Douglas had to handle the delicate matter of the United States seeking a naval coaling station at the port of Mole Saint-Nicolas, while the Haitians were afraid of the implications for their sovereignty. Douglas arrived in Haiti in October, just as General Fleury Hippolyte had become president following a coup supported by American arms. In late 1890, Harrison appointed Admiral Bancroft Gherardi as special commissioner to negotiate a lease for the mole. After Gherardi's arrival in January, he claimed that Hippolyte had made a promise to the American government to give up the mole in return for support in his coup, a claim that was vigorously denied. By April, the admiral had ordered 7 warships to the harbour of Port-au-Prince to intimidate the Haitians, a move which prompted the Haitian government to refuse the lease. Douglas criticized American policy and sympathized with the Haitians, and at the end of June he returned to the United States and resigned his post. After his return to the United States, Douglas set about defending his conduct in the negotiations for the mole, arguing that Gherardi's heavy-handed approach had scuttled a potential deal. Meanwhile, he gained sufficient credit among the Haitians that he was invited by President Hippolyte to represent Haiti at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. Douglas spent most of 1892 preparing for the Haitian pavilion and the exhibits within. When the pavilion was completed and the fair opened in January 1893, Douglas delivered speeches thanking President Hippolyte and glorifying Toussaint Louverture's slave rebellion, which had led to Haiti becoming the first free nation of color in the Americas all the way back in the 1790s. In 1894, Douglas, who by then was well into his 70s, commenced one final speaking tour as news of lynchings in the South became an almost daily occurrence. Despite these developments, Douglas still ended his speeches on an optimistic tone, urging his audiences to take action and overcome their prejudices. But the 76-year-old's exhortations were given more in hope than in expectation. By the mid-1890s, Douglas was in increasingly poor health. On the 20th of February 1895, he died from a heart attack just days after his 77th birthday, or at least the date that the former slave had chosen to represent his birth date. Frederick Douglass lived an extraordinary life, rising from slavery to become the most photographed and famous African-American of the late 19th century. From his earliest days in Maryland, he fought against a great many obstacles, but having learned to read and write and having educated himself, he fled from slavery in the South and achieved freedom in the North. There, he became something of a sensation on the abolitionist speaking circuit in the 1840s, also making an impression during his visit to Britain and Ireland. After starting out as a young radical orator on a moral and religious crusade, he later embraced American political institutions as the most effective vehicle for the abolitionist cause, making enemies out of former friends in the process. For almost 40 years, he was what we might call a functional Republican, one who realized the limitations of white reform, but worked alongside individuals like Abraham Lincoln to drive American progress forward. During the Civil War, Douglass tied the cause of the Union to the cause of abolition in his journalism and his speeches, and in doing so, galvanized support for the Union and its cause. Admittedly, in his final years, he was disappointed by the sense that the Union had won the war but lost the peace. But this only led him to rediscover his old radical voice and urge his audiences to continue fighting for equality and freedom. In doing so, he inspired the subsequent generations of African American leaders and reformers, such as Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Martin Luther King. What do you think of Frederick Douglass? Was he an effective champion of the cause of abolition and equal rights, or was he too divisive and opinionated to keep the black community united? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.